I did everything right. That's the sentence people say when they want sympathy. I say it because it's true and because it terrifies me. I followed the rules. I made sensible decisions. I avoided obvious mistakes. I chose stability over impulse, responsibility over desire, logic over feeling. From the outside, my life looks exactly like the kind of life people recommend when they want to sound wise. And yet, here I am, telling this story quietly, years later, because something essential never arrived. No disaster pushed me here. No tragedy forced my hand. Just a slow, accumulating realization that the life I built doesn't feel inhabited. I was always praised for being careful. Careful child. Careful student. Careful adult. I learned early that careful people don't get hurt as often. They don't embarrass themselves. They don't end up as cautionary tales whispered about at family gatherings. So I became careful. I thought careful meant smart. I thought it meant mature. I didn't realize it also meant constantly negotiating with fear. Every important decision in my life was filtered through the same quiet question: what's the safest option? Not what I wanted most. Not what felt alive. What felt least risky. That question followed me everywhere. When I chose work, I chose what promised security. When I chose relationships, I chose what felt stable. When I chose where to live, how to live, who to become, I chose predictability. People admired that. They said I was grounded, rational, responsible, someone with their head on straight. I accepted the compliments because they gave me reassurance that I was doing adulthood correctly. I didn't notice that none of those words described how I felt inside. Inside, I felt muted. Not unhappy. That would have been easier to name. I felt neutral. Like my emotional volume had been permanently lowered. I experienced joy in moderation, disappointment in silence, desire in theory. I told myself that was balance. Years passed like that. I achieved the things I was supposed to achieve. Crossed milestones that looked impressive from the outside. I checked boxes that other people were still chasing. And yet, whenever someone asked me what I wanted next, my mind went blank. I had never learned how to want without fear. The first crack appeared in a moment so small it almost embarrassed me. Someone asked me a simple question: if you could change one thing about your life, what would it be? I laughed it off. Made a joke. Said something vague and harmless. But later that night, alone, the question returned sharper, heavier. And I realized I didn't know the answer. Not because my life was perfect, but because I had trained myself not to imagine alternatives. Alternatives implied risk. And risk was something I had spent my entire life avoiding. That was the first time I felt something close to panic, because it occurred to me that my life wasn't the result of bold choices, it was the result of fear carefully disguised as wisdom. I started looking back with new eyes. Every time I had felt uncertain, I had chosen the path that required the least courage. Every time I had felt pulled in two directions, I had chosen the one that protected me from potential failure. I hadn't failed. But I also hadn't tried. And suddenly, a frightening possibility emerged: what if the life I called right was simply the life that demanded the least from me emotionally? I didn't know how to sit with that thought. It challenged everything I believed about myself. My identity was built on being sensible, measured, reliable. If those choices were rooted in fear, what did that say about me? The more I examined my past, the clearer the pattern became. I had avoided chaos so successfully that I had also avoided depth. I had avoided mistakes and along with them, intensity, risk, and discovery. I realized I had lived my life as if it were something to protect, not something to experience. That realization didn't come with drama. It came with grief. Grief for versions of myself that were never allowed to exist. Paths I dismissed before they could tempt me. Questions I never asked because I was afraid of their answers. I understood then that regret doesn't always come from what you do. Sometimes it comes from everything you didn't dare to do. And once that understanding settled in, I could no longer pretend that doing everything right had been enough. Once that realization took root, it didn't shout. It waited. It waited in quiet moments, in pauses between conversations, in the space that opens when you finish a task and realize there's nothing left to distract you. That's where it lived, the understanding that my life hadn't been chosen, only managed. I started noticing how deeply fear was woven into my habits. Not panic. Not terror. A calm, rational fear, the kind that speaks in reasonable sentences. This is safer. This makes sense. This is what adults do. Fear that never raises its voice doesn't feel like fear at all. It feels like intelligence. And I had trusted it for decades. Every time I looked ahead, I realized I had planned my future the same way someone plans an emergency exit, not to enjoy the building, but to escape it if something goes wrong. My goals were contingency plans. My dreams were diluted until they were harmless. I didn't chase what I wanted. I positioned myself to avoid regret. Ironically, that positioning created it. I began to feel a pressure building inside me, not explosive but relentless. A sense that time was no longer neutral. That every year I continued like this added weight to a choice I was actively making by not choosing. The question wasn't can I change, it was how much of myself will I lose if I don't. I tried to imagine the future honestly, not the polite version I usually entertained, but the real one. I pictured myself years from now, living essentially the same life, just older. Still stable. Still respected. Still careful. The image filled me with a quiet dread. Not because it looked bad, but because it looked finished. I realized that my greatest fear wasn't failure. It was permanence. The idea that this carefully constructed life might solidify into something unchangeable terrified me more than any risk ever had. Because once something becomes permanent, you can no longer tell yourself it's temporary. You can no longer hide behind for now. That's when the moral dilemma is sharpened. If I changed course now, truly changed, not adjusted around the edges, it would cost me. It would disrupt relationships. It would destabilize plans. It would make people question my judgment, maybe even my character. I had built my identity on consistency. Changing meant betraying that image. And yet, staying meant betraying myself. There was no heroic version of this choice. No path that led cleanly from fear to freedom. Only trade-offs. Only loss measured against loss. I felt guilty for wanting more. Guilty for feeling dissatisfied when so much was objectively fine. Guilty for questioning a life others might envy. That guilt kept me frozen longer than I care to admit. Because guilt has a way of moralizing fear. It tells you that wanting change is selfish. That restlessness is ingratitude. That discomfort is a sign you should try harder to be content. I believed it for a long time. But something had shifted irreversibly. I could no longer pretend my caution was noble. I could no longer confuse fear with wisdom. I started asking myself harder questions, the kind I had avoided because they didn't have safe answers. What do I want, even if it scares me? Who am I when I stop optimizing for approval? What part of me have I been silencing in the name of being right? The answers didn't arrive neatly. Some days, all I felt was confusion. Other days, anger, not at anyone else, but at myself. Anger for having waited so long to notice. Anger for mistaking avoidance for maturity. I began to understand something painful but freeing. I hadn't been unlucky. I had been cautious to the point of self-denial. That understanding didn't tell me what to do next. It only told me that doing nothing was no longer neutral. Every day I stayed exactly the same became an active decision to keep living a life shaped by fear. And once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. The weight of that awareness was heavy. I stood at the edge of change, knowing that whatever I chose would define the rest of my life, not because it would fix everything, but because it would reveal who I truly was. Someone who continued to hide behind being right. Or someone who risked being wrong in order to finally feel alive. The decision didn't arrive as a bold declaration. It arrived as surrender, not to fear, but to truth. I accepted that there was no version of my life where I could change without loss, no path where I would be applauded for finally choosing myself. No timeline where fear would politely step aside and let me move forward confidently. I had waited for clarity. What I got instead was responsibility. I stopped asking whether I was ready. That question had kept me trapped for years. Readiness was always just one more condition away, one more improvement, one more reassurance I never actually needed. What I needed was permission, and the hardest part was realizing that no one could give it to me. So I gave it to myself. Not loudly. Not dramatically. I didn't burn everything down. I didn't chase fantasies or pretend I could rewrite the past. I simply began making choices that weren't optimized for safety. Small ones at first. I chose honesty when silence would have been easier. I chose uncertainty when predictability felt suffocating. I chose paths that didn't guarantee success but felt aligned with something I had ignored for too long. Every choice felt exposed. There were moments when I wondered if I had made a mistake. When the old fear returned and whispered that I was dismantling a perfectly acceptable life for nothing more than a feeling. When I questioned whether this late awakening was wisdom or just panic dressed up as courage. But even in doubt, something fundamental had changed. I was no longer hiding from myself. I felt fear, yes, but it was clean fear. Honest fear. Not the quiet, manipulative kind that had guided me for years. This fear didn't pretend to be wisdom. It didn't promise protection. It simply existed alongside the choice. And that made all the difference. I learned that doing everything right had never been about morality. It had been about control. About minimizing exposure. About constructing a life where nothing unexpected could touch me. But a life built entirely around control slowly becomes a life without depth. I had protected myself from pain, and in doing so, I had also protected myself from meaning. Now, my life looks less impressive from the outside. It's messy. Less predictable. Harder to summarize in polite conversations. I no longer have perfect answers when people ask what I'm doing next. But for the first time, I feel present in my own decisions. I feel the weight of them. And I accept it. I don't romanticize this change. There are losses I still mourn. Stability I sometimes miss, paths I closed by choosing others. Responsibility feels heavier when it's no longer shared with fear. But regret feels different now. It's no longer about what I didn't dare to do. It's about what I chose knowingly even when the outcome was uncertain. That kind of regret is bearable. I understand now that the tragedy of my life was never a wrong decision. It was the absence of decision altogether. The slow outsourcing of my choices to what felt safest, smartest, most acceptable. Fear made those choices for me quietly, efficiently, convincingly. Until it couldn't anymore. If there is one truth I carry forward, it's this: a life lived correctly is not the same as a life lived consciously. Safety is not the same as fulfillment. And avoiding mistakes is not the same as living without regret. I didn't lose myself because I did something wrong. I lost myself because I was too afraid to choose. And now, even late, even imperfectly, even without guarantees, I choose. Not because it promises happiness, but because it allows me to finally live a life that feels like mine. And that, after everything, is worth the cost.